Yes, I think we are all on board. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations morning briefing on geopolitical challenges. I'm Aylin, Hoff, Executive Editor of Internationale Politik Quarterly. Russia's war against Ukraine entered its 477th day. Ukrainian forces have continued their offensive operations in eastern Ukraine along three axes, making some territorial gains. However, the area affected by massive flooding following the Kakhovka dam break, highly likely caused by Russian forces blowing it up, is not suitable for military operations presently. Russia continued its terror bombing on civilian targets, killing 3 in Odessa, in Terabia. As Germany internalized by now the many challenges Russia's war and rapidly changing geopolitical as well as geoeconomic environment are posing, an answer, or so many hoped, was provided by Germany's first ever National Security Strategy, or NSS, which was presented at 11 a.m. yesterday by a German coalition government putting up a currently unusual united front. Drafted by the German Foreign Office and Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock in the lead, it took roughly half a year longer to finalize than originally envisaged. The document is called Integrated Security for Germany, and it is 76 pages long. Using my tried and tested journalistic methods of analysis, I can tell you that Russia is mentioned 13 times, China 6 times, and the Indo-Pacific once. It starts by quoting the preamble of the German constitution as the raison d'etre serving the peace in the world as part of a united Europe. Annalena Baerbock reminded us all yesterday that peace and liberty are not God-given, sie fallen nicht vom Himmel. To dig deeper into the NSS, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Kamp. He was the president of the Federal Academy for Security Policy, also known by its German acronym BAX, from 2015 and to 2019. After that, he served as special advisor to the political director of the German Defense Ministry. He very recently retired, but before that, he was involved in the drafting process of the NSS, and he has also written about that in the current issue of Survival. A very warm welcome, Karl-Heinz Kamp.
Thank you.
We also have with us Dr. Aylin Matlé, Research Fellow at the Center for Security and Defense here at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Aylin has published widely on the Zeitenwende, especially on its military aspects, as well as on the NSS, most recently in this morning's DGAP newsletter. Hope most of you have sort of received it this morning, and also in a policy brief called From Forward Presence to Forward Defense, available on the DGAP website. Good morning, Aylin. And last but not least, we have with us Dr. Guntram Wolff, the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, who has also widely commented on the NSS, most recently criticizing its lateness and the fact that the coalition was seemingly unable to agree on a couple of key points. Very good morning, Guntram. We are trying to make this format more interactive, and to start us off, I will put questions to each panelist. After a discussion on the panel, we will be opening up for your questions and comments. For the Q&A, please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and put the question in person to the panel. You're also welcome to use the chat function, and I'll do my very best to put your questions to the panel. Please note that the event will be recorded and that we will have to close on time at 9:30 a.m. And with a word of thanks to Milan Nitsch and Jan Stöckmann, as well to our colleagues at the Events and Communications team, let's start with Karl-Heinz Kamp. So, what, in your view, are the most important aspects of the new national security strategy?
Well, I think we have at least 5 key takeaways on the strategy. The first one is that basically, as always in the strategies, the process of formulating the document was as important, at least as important, than the document itself, simply because 2 of the coalition parties, the SPD and the Greens, had to move a lot. Like the entire country had to move a lot over the last 16 months. And if you recall that Germany was in February 22 with the embarrassing 5,000 helmet thing, and now we are the second largest supporter of Ukraine, you see that a lot has changed. The second takeaway is that, for me, the sheer fact that the national security strategy exists is a value in itself, because it codifies commitments which will be difficult to ignore in future. You see it with the 2%, something which the Merkel government never made explicit before, And you see it with arms exports, that basically 2 weeks ago, the German defense minister could be very outspoken in India with regard to arms exports. The third point important for me is that it is a true strategy in sense of a means to end relation. Germany is not famous for these kind of things. And it's a hard security document. And we from the MOD insisted on this hard security thing really early. The fourth point is that, and that's interesting, it will trigger a public debate, as it already does. The interesting thing is that given the fact that the Greens and the Social Democrats formulated this thing, will prevent that these discussions will follow the old lines as we had in the dual track decision or in the Iraq war. Here the warmongers and there the peace lovers. This doesn't go anymore. And I mean, you see it with a formulation that arms exports, that Germany regards the freedom of trade and raw material as a national interest. For this formulation in 2011, the German then president had to resign. And the fifth point, really important, is that the NSS is a capstone document, the highest level document, and the base for further detailed strategies. We will have a China strategy, which is basically done since a while, to be published in July. The Ministry of Defense will develop a space strategy, hopefully by the end of this year. For the implementation of the security strategy, we will have new verteidigungspolitische Richtlinien, defense policy guidelines, so not a new white paper. And together with the Ministry of Interior, we will have a new Rahmenrichtlinie Gesamtverteidigung, overall defense. So it has a number of very concrete implications, and that's, I think, it's a positive thing.
Thank you very much, Aylin. What are your most important?
Thanks for the invitation. Good morning from my side as well. So viewed through a defense lens, I'd like to share 3 observations with you that stand out in my mind in particular. And the first is what I would coin as NATO first, EU second policy for European security. What I mean by that, I will elaborate a bit further in just a bit, but let me just say first that in that sense, the NSS seems to be a very ordinary German document, as it is in line with other strategic documents affecting European and transatlantic security. Most importantly and prominently in that regard, NATO's 2022 strategic concept, but also the EU strategic compass, both of which underscore that NATO is the go-to organization for collective defense in Europe and the Euro-Atlantic arena. And against the backdrop of what I just said, I don't find it very surprising it should not be surprising that the NSS clearly states that credible deterrence and defense capability is in the transatlantic alliance of NATO is the indispensable foundation of German, European, and transatlantic security. And furthermore, it states that NATO is the supreme guarantor of protection against military threats. Secondly, and closely linked to the first observation, is that NATO seems to be the preferred forum through which to organize defense and not the European Union. And that observation, in my mind, is mirrored in the language on what the Bundeswehr is tasked with. Something, by the way, that Chancellor Scholz already pointed out and hinted at last September. And that is, I quote again, the core mission of the Bundeswehr is national and alliance defense, or as Germans would call it, Landes- und Bündnisverteidigung, and all other tasks are subordinate to this mission. The German government will maintain the military capabilities required for this and rapidly close capability gaps. Furthermore, the NSS states that we are strengthening the Bundeswehr as a cornerstone of conventional defense in Europe. Again, something that Scholz had already promised before last year. And in light of those statements, very clear statements at that, I don't find it surprising that crisis management and the EU's role therein comes across as rating a poor second. In other words, according to the NSS, at least that's my interpretation, the prioritization of tasks of the armed forces doesn't leave much, if any, room for interpretation, and I think that is good news. Because obviously, one of the sort of ideas behind formulating a strategy is to prioritize. Thirdly, what I found very interesting and somewhat surprising, especially in light of the Social Democrats and Greens being part of this government and the foreign minister, a member of the Green Party, being the sort of pen holder, or at least her ministry of the document, is the clarity in language on nuclear deterrence. And to such an extent that I find it almost identical, or maybe it is even identical, to what you would find in a NATO document. I quote again, "As long as nuclear weapons exist, maintaining a credible nuclear deterrent is essential for NATO and for the security of Europe." And furthermore, the document doesn't shy away from clearly pointing out that Germany has a very particular role to play, that being to further contributing to NATO's nuclear sharing mission. And obviously that is something, the purchase and of making sure that the right carrier aircraft are in place is something that has already been put in motion in the last couple of months, with the decision to buy the F-35 aircraft to replace the current Tornado in its role as contributing to NATO's nuclear sharing mission. With that, I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Aylin. Now let's turn to Guntram. What are your most striking points?
Yes, thank you so much, Henning, and good morning also from my side. Let me make five quick points. I mean, the first is concurrent with Karl-Heinz Kamp. It's good that the process is ongoing and has now come to some conclusion, but the process is really part of the goal, and it will continue, and it's not the end of the process. When you look at the document, and that's my second point, there is a question: how big is the shift in strategic orientation when you look at the document as a whole? And I think, as Aylin pointed out, in the military and defense field, it is quite significant. In other fields, I feel that the shift is much more gradual and or perhaps even absent. And I'm wondering whether the depth of the strategic challenge as regards China, the economic rivalry, the systemic rivalry, and the multipolarity is fully grasped in the document. And let me just dwell on this point of systemic rivalry and multipolarity. If you start from the observation that China is a systemic rival, and that point is strengthened, the language on that is somewhat strengthened in the document, it is actually quite important to then draw the right conclusions in terms of the economic resilience strategy. And I don't think that has fully been drawn yet. The chapter on economic resilience focuses quite strongly on diversification and critical raw materials. But there is no serious discussion of how European instruments should be used to increase our economic resilience. In the systemic rivalry, there is a bit of language on trade agreements for the EU, but not much more than that. And of course, the big missing piece here is Taiwan. I mean, there's no discussion of what would or could happen in sort of dramatic scenarios around Taiwan, where economic resilience would be really put under heavy strain. So my feeling is on the China resilience systemic rivalry point, the thinking has moved, but I'm not sure it has moved sufficiently commensurate with the challenge. Now, let me make two further quick points, and Aylin referred already quickly to the money point. Obviously, when you have a strategy and you don't have money behind it, it's actually very difficult to implement anything. And what you see in this document is you see a commitment to the 2% goal on average, which I think is for defense, which I think is good news, and which actually means if you underspend now, you have to overspend in the next years. Yeah. So if this year or next year we are below the 2%, well, then basically what the document says is that after 26 or 27, we should spend 2.5 or 3% on defense, which, you know, I'm not sure that is fully meant politically, but that's what the text says. But the money issue goes beyond the defense side. It goes to all the other fields as well. And what you see there is a sentence which reads a bit cryptic, but which basically says that there cannot be additional resources if you want to use resources for, or we commit to use resources for these strategic aims by ways of cutting other resources and other spending items. And that's going to be a very, very difficult task in times when the debt brake is going to be applied. My very last point, and I think I speak already too long, is on trying to figure out what really are the priorities. And Henning, you mentioned the counting exercise. So I counted the term Russia, so RUSS, yeah. So because there's also the adjective and so on. So I counted 20 times the terms Russia, China much less. But interestingly, climate, the term climate comes 70 times, 70. So climate is really the dominant theme in this document if you just do the counting exercise. And I would say that is not really a surprise because the ministry in charge of drafting the document is, of course, the foreign ministry, is the foreign ministry. And the foreign ministry has a constituency, a relatively young constituency, which puts a lot of value, the Green Party puts a lot of value and a lot of importance on the climate security threat. And let me just refer to our survey. We have just done a survey among our DGAP members. And what you see in that survey is that in the younger generation, climate risks is identified as one of the top risks, while in the above 65 generation, it is Russia, the top threat. And so you really see that climate comes out so strongly in a ministry run by a green minister, because of course the young are an important political constituency also here. So those were my quick first points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guntram. Karl-Heinz Kamp, maybe you want to also start to react to some of the points your co-panelists have made, but I had a sort of additional specific question for you, sort of since you were sort of engaged or part of the drafting process, whether you can tell us a little bit more about this process and where the stumbling blocks were actually.
Well, thank you. A short reaction to Guntram Wolff's point that Taiwan is missing. Others were mentioned that the idea of a post-war Russia order is missing, or that is missing the question of security guarantees for the Ukraine. We or the group intentionally decided to have a high level of abstraction in the strategy, which means these detailed things are not something for a national security strategy. This is why, as I said, we have these follow-on documents to make this more specific. So I think it would but if we would have gone in this on this level of detail, the entire paper would have had, I don't know, hundreds of pages. On the process, I think initially we had 4 key disputes on the. By the way, it is worth mentioning that the entire process for me went fairly consensual. I was involved in 2 strategic concepts of the NATO that was much worse. So the 4 key issues we had initially was first the issue of arms exports. Germany is now exporting in a war zone. Even is this an example for others? Second point, the famous 2%. Shall they be mentioned, yes or no, in the national security strategy? Third key point for a long time an issue was the question of competencies of the lenders with regard to disaster protection. Shall the federal level have more competencies on this, yes or no? And the fourth issue, something which is always there, namely the question of whether the budget for development aid should be increased in the same percentage as the budget for defense, which is even in the coalition treatment. So these were the key issues for a long time. The National Security Council was a completely different ballgame. We had very early a compromise formulation in the first draft, saying that the government will form sort of a permanent cabinet committee, permanenter Kabinettsausschuss, and then let's talk about the details later. That made much sense because it's an extremely tricky issue. And then one ministry broke up this compromise, and of course then there was a big fight, which was reported in Der Spiegel, and at the end this entire wording was deleted. So I was not sure whether this was the best solution of all, to delete the entire thing, but that was a key issue. And at the end, for us, for the Ministry of Defense, the document was done in mid-March. So on the 16th of March, our minister approved the draft. And since then, we had these discussions among the Länder and some tiny issues, and that's why it took a little longer. But at the end of the day, I think it's a major project, and it's the first national security strategy we ever wrote. So if it takes a month more or less, it's not a huge issue.
Thank you very much. Aylin, I wanted to ask you about sort of what you expect from our allies and partners, whether they sort of, there was much interest in sort of this process, especially in the United States. Do you think there will be sort of, or what kind of reaction do you expect from Washington in particular? And if you want to react to other points raised by panelists, also please go ahead.
Thank you. Let me start by firstly pointing out that I think as much as, sort of domestic German audience, the international audience, and especially our allies are probably relieved that the document was finally published after all. And I think much of what Germany had announced and even decided upon in the wake of the Zeitenwende since last year can be found to some extent in the national security strategy. And I think in some ways that is reassuring because it means consistency. In other ways, maybe not so much, or at least not to the full satisfaction of some allies. And you mentioned the United States in particular. I will comment on that in just a bit. First, I would also like to mention the sort of the Baltic states and also Poland, making up parts of the so-called eastern flank in NATO. And I think from their perspective, most of what you can find in the document on deterrence and defense is probably seen as the right wording, even in some respects the expected and anticipated wording. However, the question remains, and it also goes back to a bit of what Guntram said with regards to the money and funding, how to put those strategic outlines into practice. Especially, I'm thinking in that regard, especially of Lithuania, where Germany is a lead nation of the Enhanced Forward Presence forces and has also promised the designation of a brigade, which caused a lot of sort of quarrel in bilateral relations between the two countries. Turning to the United States, I think, again, much will depend from their perspective on how to put principles into practice. For example, with regards to China, I'm pretty sure that the United States administration government is eagerly waiting for the China strategy to be published to have a clearer idea on where Germany wants to take its relationship with China. But also, yes, it was already mentioned that the 2% are mentioned in the document, or is mentioned in the document, in the strategic national security strategy. However, much will still depend on whether Germany will actually reach that goal. And let's bear in mind that that goal was already agreed upon in 2014, at least publicly, at the Wales summit of NATO. And next year, in 2024, sort of the 10 years which the allies back then had agreed upon, during which they tried to, or agreed to work towards that goal, will be up. And I think especially the United States, but also other allies along the eastern flank especially, will very closely watch and scrutinize how and whether and how Germany will reach that goal. And if I may, just one last sentence on France, and I'm sure there's much more to say on other allies, also France. But what I found, at least scanning through the document, sort of quickly yesterday, I found the paragraph quite interesting where it says that European solutions with regards to defense procurement will be relied upon primarily if this is possible without compromising capabilities. In other words, the decisive, and that's what it says in the strategy, the decisive criterion remains the rapid closure of capability gaps, which already has been decided upon in the so-called Zimmererlass a couple of weeks ago. So that sounds like the prioritization once again of the shelf solutions and not so much the reliance on European solutions, which, at least in my interpretation, isn't exactly in line with what France would like to hear transpire, especially with regards to the sort of notion of European sovereignty and or autonomy.
Thank you very much. Very interesting points. Guntram, sort of after the NSS, before the NSS, we already heard there's so many more documents are coming up. Do you think that we have the German government is now on a good path to meet the various challenges, or sort of what is most important now going forward?
Well, listen, I think, as I said, I think it's good to have a document, and it's good to have the process, and it's good that there are further documents following, because clearly this document is quite limited on its China coverage. And I do think that among the sort of big security risks that Germany has to reflect on, I mean, there's the military one on which this document is relatively strong, and that's very much Russia. And then there is China, which is basically putting in danger our economic model, the way China is currently operating in the global economic system. And that's why I mentioned Taiwan, not that I wanted to have a separate discussion on sort of what is the Taiwan strategy of the German government. That's not what I was aiming for. I was just trying to explain that we need to get a sense of the magnitude of the problem and the magnitude of the strategic shift that is necessary to deal with an eventual shocks such as Taiwan. And when you read the economic resilience chapter, it's all about some critical raw materials, some diversification, which is all, I mean, it doesn't give you the sense of really shifting gear. And so for me, the big thing going forward is really those two things. I mean, it's how much do we shift gear in terms of strategic orientation, and how well do we implement what we write here? Because there's so many policy recommendations in this document. I mean, this is full of recommendations. It's going to be very difficult to put all of that in place. And you need the money, you need the resources, but you need also the political will. So a lot will depend on political implementation in the coming years now.
Thank you very much. We have a first question from Astrid Striese. Maybe you want to come in, and there's one in the chat I also.
Thank you. What is your expectation? What will other countries think about our paper? Do you think they could say it's typical Germany a little carefully, or do you think they will say it's on the point, it's strong, and we are going a new way?
Thank you very much. And there's another question by Frau Dr. Schäfer-Preuß, who's asking about the global South, sort of what kind of role it plays in this strategic document. Maybe first to Karl-Heinz Kamp, who knows how to deal with allies and sort of what kind of expectations they have.
Well, I think as it was said a couple of times on the 2%, the proof of the pudding lies in the eating. So the next budget, the next federal budget, will show how serious Germany is with regard to underpinning all the ideas with the budget. Before we complain about the 2%, which often happens, we should keep in mind that the 100 billion law, so the law that permitted the 100 billion euros of the Sondervermögen, contains a sentence. I'm not sure whether all the parliamentarians read this before they agreed on this on the thing, which says that when the 100 billion are spent, are consumed, Germany will provide a budget which is sufficient to fulfill NATO's planning goals. This is written there. If this is true, then 2% will by far not enough. So there are a number of commitments of the government which will be interesting to see, particularly with regard to other competing issues like climate, like education, like what have you. But the commitments are all there. We have the Chancellor 3 times saying 2%. We have the National Security Strategy saying 2%. We have this 100 billion law. So I think that our allies will strongly look on the next budget and to see whether Germany really puts its money where the words are.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Aylin, you want to come in as well?
I think Karl-Heinz Kamp already said everything that needs to be said in this regard. And also, I mentioned earlier what I think some important allies will look at. And that mostly comes down to military capabilities, which obviously have to be funded somehow. So I think that is what most of Germany's allies will follow very closely in the next couple of weeks and months.
Follow the money, so to speak. Guntram, maybe you want to talk sort of the global south. Is it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one word on the global south. I actually thought that there's quite a bit. I mean, it's not called global south, right? I mean, there's always this debate. We are not allowed to call it global south. So I think it's now global partnerships or something of that sort in terms of language. And I think there's quite a bit of language on that. So sorry.
So please keep your microphones off if you're not speaking. Sorry.
So I was just finishing to say, I mean, there's quite a bit of language on the global south and how to work with global partners and provide the appropriate funding on climate adaptation and so on and so forth. So I actually think that's quite strong in this document.
Thank you very much. Next question comes from Philip Hilsenmenzel, and I saw that a DGAP colleague, Betty Schuh, was actually also has a question. Maybe you want to put it in person. And Philip, please.
Yeah, thank you all for your very interesting insights so far. I must confess I haven't had the chance to read it, so I'm going to use this opportunity to quiz you. And my question concerns energy security. How concrete is the strategy on really ensuring energy security? If I look at what's been out there in terms of both at the EU level and the national level, then I have to say it's always full of warm words, but there are very little. So far, I'm not aware of any concrete plans. For instance, I mean, right now as Germany, we import about 70% of our final energy needs. And there is no discussion that I'm aware of how we will source this, and no analysis, no serious analysis of how we will source this in the future. And of course, related to this, in a rapidly changing energy world, is the question of where do we get the technology to harvest the renewable energy that we're increasingly turning towards from. And right now, the answer is, of course, 90% China. And again, there are warm words from the EU of wanting to reshore this, but no concrete plans. And maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this, on what the plans are there, and if there's also a European dimension to this, because of course, and that is a very European issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Betty, your question, please.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thank you also to the panelists. Happy to just state my question and chat in person, or not in person, by talking to you now. So on the point of arms exports, I mean, the brief mentioning in the paper is, of course, also referring to the restrictive guidelines, etc., but also mentioning the consideration of alliance and security interests and the geostrategic situation, which is interesting framing. And of course, this is a big shift, but I'm also wondering if that shift also plays out, or how that shift might play out in the process behind such decisions on arms exports. If maybe Karl-Heinz Kamp could say something about this, that would be very interesting, particularly the role of the MRD and the MFA would be interesting. And also, I mean, exporting arms, transferring build technology, to put simply, is one thing, but in terms of R&D, joint design and manufacture, that is something also that plays a bigger role maybe now with partners that are not EU partners. I know it's a very sensitive and tricky issue, but for example, when looking to India or other partners in the Indo-Pacific, not having a say to some degree, but having more insights into how certain technologies are being built or designed and built, and having manufacture capabilities is very important to certain states, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. So I would be interested if there's any signs of shift here as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Karl-Heinz Kamp, would you want to speak to the export question?
Yes. I mean, on the two things, on the energy security and on the arms exports. First, once again, to remind, the national security strategy has a high level of abstraction, which means you don't find detailed wording on the energy security. As I said, it is important that it's formulated that energy security, raw material security, is in the German national interest. And as I said, a former president had to resign for this wording alone. So this is why it cannot be more specific. On the arms export, it's interesting that the strategy makes 2 points. First, it links arms exports also to national interest. So we keep with all our restrictions, but it links to national interest, and it links it to the support of partners for their self-defense, which enables Germany also in future to support Ukraine and other countries. And you saw it, as I said, Minister Pistorius was in India, and he agreed on arms exports basics there, something which wouldn't have been possible only a while ago. There is still the Eckpunktepapier in the Ministry of Economy. To my knowledge, it is not finished yet. It is an extremely tricky issue within the government. So that's why this fine wording has to be chosen. But I find it remarkable that what couldn't be achieved for decades, because this arms export thing is an old issue, now has these two elements, interest-related and support of partners. And this permits a lot to do with regard to arms exports. We will never go as far, for very good reasons, as far as France or as far as the UK, but more flexibility. And also it has, once again, the wording of exportability. European cooperation has to be exportability. So I think this is a fundamental change.
Guntram.
Yeah. So Henning, just a few sentences on the energy security. So I just counted the words. So it's 23 times Energieversorgung. Energie comes 23 times. So that's substantial. So in terms of priority, and it even has a picture of the LNG terminal that Germany has built. And so my first argument would really be that the big adjustment that has happened last year is really proof of a very, very significant shift in terms of energy security thinking and action in Germany. And so that has been quite impressive, and it's clearly in this document. And there is clearly also a focus on sort of critical raw materials that are needed for the future energy systems. So I would say on this energy topic, it's quite good, but it doesn't make, because that was also your question, it doesn't make a lot of reference to the EU processes there, like the Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Material Act. So there I would have wished a bit more integrated thinking. But after all, it's a national strategy, and now it has to be put together with the other national strategies in Europe to form a truly European strategy on energy.
Thanks very much. And since we are talking energy, Tom O'Donnell has raised his hand also. So Tom, please, your question.
Good morning, everybody. I like Guntram's method of counting. So I wanted to look, being from the States, I looked for the United States. I didn't find any USAs with or without periods, but I found the United States 3 times, once in a footnote. And I'd like to, well, maybe to Guntram, it just seems unrealistic considering the way the international Western security structure is. But on the energy issue, there's 2 issues, I would say, for German energy dependence. One is all the minerals that come with 100% renewable strategy, and they overwhelmingly come from China. Number 2, I heard a member of the cabinet a couple of days ago say everything's going to work fine with hydrogen as long as we can import 40 to 70% of it. So my comment, if anybody who'd like to respond, I know this is a general document, but the slightest conflict, armed conflict between the United States and China, it's not like what happens in Ukraine. It will be directly between China and the United States. All commerce with China will essentially be shut down by the United States. And Germany is abjectly dependent on China for minerals. And then there's also the import of hydrogen, if that ever happens, from various areas. And I just don't, could somebody speak to this? I think this connection is not made.
Thanks, Tom. Guntram, would you want to react?
Yeah, so let me react to the 2 points. I mean, one on the hydrogen. So I just counted Wasserstoff. Yeah, so it appears once. So it appears 3 times. And it basically says the German government should work on a hydrogen import strategy. I mean that's basically what it says. It's clearly not a document about sort of what's the future energy system going to look like, and that was not the aim of this document. So fair enough. On the critical raw materials that you mentioned again, and where of course the dependency on China is huge, it is quite strong in this document, this discussion on critical raw materials and that the need to diversify them. Now, I guess my view on this is I'm somewhat less worried about this aspect in the China conflict because it would interrupt the building of new renewables, not the building of and not disrupt existing renewable energy infrastructure. And so in that sense, it's a lesser security risk, like the security risk of turning off the tap of gas, right? So in that sense, I'm a little bit more relaxed there. When it comes to China, I'm more worried about what you just described. What happens in case of a really major confrontation? And then we see not just critical raw materials being affected. We see chips. We see everything is going to be affected. And there, I don't get the sense of strategic urgency to really think this through. That was my first point, basically, on the economic resilience, where I think a bigger thinking needs to happen still.
Thank you very much. I wanted to come back to a question which was raised in the chat by Helmut Ganser, and this is sort of the missing sort of hard deliverable of the national strategy, the sort of famous National Security Council. As Karl-Heinz has explained, it was sort of taken out completely. But where are we left with now? Do we have a sort of do we now have a sort of integrated strategy, but we don't have no integrated body in the German ministerial setup, which could deliver on this kind of integrated strategy, or is that is this worry overblown that we that this sort of kind of cabinet office or whatever shape or form it will, or cabinet committee it will actually which shape it will take, sort of is not so important after all. Maybe Karl-Heinz Kamp, you want to address this?
Well, on the National Security Council, I had loved to have this initial wording in it, which basically lays the seed. We agree on knowing that how difficult it is, knowing that we will not get a change of our constitution, knowing that we would have to find a solution, so to speak, below the change of the constitution. And there are some models which could be done. I would have loved to have this initial formulation in it by saying we will do a permanenter Kabinettsausschuss, and then let's see how this figures out. It didn't come that way. It's a shame. On the other hand, the first comments or a few comments I saw recently, yesterday and today, since this National Security Council is missing, the entire strategy goes down the drain. This is not the case. I mean, Germany did foreign policy quite well, or not so well, in the recent years, with or without this Security Council. It would be probably better. The problem is that our constitutional system, with the strong role of the ministries, makes it difficult. So even if we would agree today on, let's say we have an NSC and we have Henry Kissinger #2, the entire figuring out how this person or how this team which influence it has. Is it a ministry? Is he a minister? Is he sitting at the cabinet table? And so on and so forth. Does he take the reason why one of the ministries broke the consensus was because it wanted to have more say on the agenda. On the other hand, it's a very practical question. The Chancellor's Office has taken, for good reasons, a number of key topics under its control, Chefsache. Still, defense policy is in the Chancellery made by 5 or 6 people, which means the sheer workload is too high. So it would be helpful to find a solution to ease their workload. Whether you need a full-fledged NSC model, I don't know. But as I said, it's the first national security strategy. And any new government is free, maybe even obliged, I would love this also, to write their own security strategy. So we couldn't agree on this, but this is certainly one of the issues left for the next security strategy. But let's not pretend that Germany goes down the drain because we don't have a National Security Council.
Thank you very much. Aylin, do you want to come in on that? Sort of, maybe not going down the drain, but this is still sort of detrimental to the effectiveness of a foreign policy aus einem Guss. I think that is the formulation in the coalition agreement, to have a foreign security policy, which is a sort of interlinked whole. There's also the proposal brought forward by Wolfgang Ischinger and Christoph Heusgen before the election, sort of merging the Foreign Office and the Development Ministry. Do you see this kind of? It probably won't come in this legislature period, I think. But it's do you see a need to make changes also in the apparatus?
First off, I would say let's wait and see, because obviously the paper was the strategy was only published yesterday, and I wouldn't jump to any conclusions just yet because let's see how it plays out. I hope there will be some sort of integrated assessment of the implementation of what's been laid out and laid down in the strategy, and also the follow-on strategies. However, I still do think that it is somewhat a missed opportunity that a body was not established, and whether that's the sort of whether that would have come in the form of establishing an entirely new body, a cabinet and Kabinettsausschuss, or whether that would have come in the form of just extending the already existing Bundessicherheitsrat. I think that is a bit beside the point. I think the reason why some are eager to criticize the missed opportunity now is, it really comes back to the aspiration and the ambition of implementing, of formulating an integrated security approach, an integrated security and policy approach. And I think for that, it really would have been helpful to have a sort of a body backing that up. Also, what with regards to what Karl-Heinz Kamp just mentioned, the staff necessary to work on those issues in coming from different angles and different ministries on a daily basis. I don't see that anything of that sort will still be implemented in the current legislature period of government. However, maybe after the end of this government, we will hopefully at least see another an update of the current security strategy being proposed and being written.
Thank you very much, Guntram. What's your take on the structure of German foreign security policy?
Well, I mean, I was initially thinking we need some sort of a national security council, not just to coordinate work, but really to be in the business of. And I see here, for example, there's a question by David Fouquet on sort of peripheral threats and risks, right? I mean, we need some mechanism to also detect and identify early on risks that are not sort of already discussed in the newspaper columns. And I think for what you need for that is you need a diversity of views, and you need different ministries, but also outside of the government, you need players, independent thinkers, independent analysis to feed into that kind of a process. And so I think, I mean, I understand that in a coalition government with the strong role of the ministries, you can't really have a national security council that is sort of doesn't really fit the structure. I can sense that, but I would have appreciated forming some sort of a, perhaps attached to the parliament, some form of a sort of body that would think about sort of major black swan risk, type of risks. So,
Karl-Heinz Kamp, you want to come in as well?
Well, I just wanted to add one point. First, once again, to repeat, yes, it would have been a good occasion, and it's a shame that we did not have at least laid the seed for it. On the other hand, when I see the comments of Ischinger and Heusgen, I mean, representative of the foreign ministry before, representative of the Chancellor's office before, the foreign ministry never in the last 20 years wanted a National Security Council. The Chancellor's office, Chancellor Merkel, Chancellor Kohl, they never wanted a national security strategy because this is something that would entangle their freedom to act. So, as I said, it would have been nice, but it's not a huge disaster. And as I said, a new government, and we have elections in 2 years, is free to start the thing again. And there would be a number of advantages to have this thing, and there are a number of models already on the table. We have a number of models evolved in the MOD on how to do it. But as I said, it is not the end of the world.
Thank you. And maybe you want to also address the question by David Fouquet, the kind of peripheral threats, counterterrorism, Sahel, and so on. We all made the point that, or the panel made the point that sort of the return to territorial and alliance defense, it's a completely different concept now to compare to 10 years earlier. So, is this still sort of part of a mix, or is it really sort of something Germany wouldn't look into in the way it did until very recently?
Well, I think the threat posed by terrorism is very prominently mentioned in the strategy as one of the key challenges we have. But I think the good point of the strategy is that it gives a prioritization, and the priority now is Russia. and it is mentioned really clearly. And of course, we have a moving target. Imagine the strategy would have been done after 6 weeks. Okay, we have started in March, and let's assume we would have been done in April. It would have sounded completely different than it sounds now. So we also needed this evolution in the government, in the society on this. As I said, from 5,000 embarrassing helmets to the second largest provider for Ukraine, with every step being painful. Yes, tanks, no tanks, more hours, and so on. So, of course, if we would start now again writing this document and would present it in half a year, it would again sound differently. So I think given the requirements of being abstract enough not to go in any nitty-gritty things because it gets too long then, on the other hand, of prioritization of the issues, this went fairly well. And I found the mentioning of deterrence and defense, in its general terms, remarkable, and something we have not touched so far, the nuclear wording. The wording on how to deal with nuclear deterrence is taken exactly one-to-one from NATO documents, something which would not have been possible a year ago or 2 years ago. So I think this document is also a proof that the Zeitenwende is really going on, whether quick enough or not enough, I don't know, but it's going on, and it has led to a number of conclusions already.
Thank you very much. I think that point was made actually by Aylin, that this sort of how strongly the document sort of puts an emphasis on nuclear deterrence. Aylin, there's a question sort of on procurement and US-Germany cooperations in that sort of whether you see Germany aiming for this kind of a close US-Germany procurement relationship at the and whether the procurement sort of should focus on Army, Navy, or Air Force. Very detailed question at the end, and we're running out of time. But maybe you want to talk to the sort of the general view on these kind of cooperations with partners and allies.
Well, at least in practice, it seems as though Germany is really going for the sort of off-the-shelf solutions, and in practice that also means, or has meant so far, that the preferred go-to ally to buy from is the United States. And I think, as I said earlier, there's this one sentence, one paragraph, where the strategy talks about how, in theory, the German government is trying to rely on European solutions, but in practice, that's my interpretation, it will, time is of the essence. And so I guess in the end, it will, end in a sort of compromise between trying to fit, go for quick solutions, quick fixes, but at the same time, that's my hunch at least, trying not to foreclose and forgo the opportunity to build or to strengthen the European industrial defense base. And I just wanted to, if I may, just one very quick last sentence on the question of prioritization, and balancing between the territorial defense and deterrence and crisis management and the fight, the war on terror. Actually, that's really not a sort of new development, because if you look at the Konzeption der Bundeswehr, the conception of the Bundeswehr, which was published in last time in 2018, and there it is clearly stated that the main task of the Bundeswehr is territorial defense and not crisis management. And I think so it really goes back a long way, and so it's only consequential that now in the most important security document of the German government, and that prioritization is really, put in writing again.
Thank you very much. And with an eye on the clock, we've got just 1 minute left. I think that the panel in general, if I sense it, that is the right way, is agreed that this is a big step and a positive one. So I wanted to ask you very quickly to round us off and going in reverse order, starting with Guntram. Sort of glass half full or half empty? Sort of how optimistic are you that Germany is on the right track Guntram?
Well, usually I like to be in the camp of glass half full, but here I would prefer probably to say glass half empty, because it still feels to me that there is so much in this document, and the distance from what is in this document to the action is still very big in so many spaces. So glass half empty.
Okay, Aylin.
At least because I'm super thirsty, I'm going for the glass half full option. But to be a bit more serious here, I think especially with regards to the defense aspect, it really is, I wouldn't say a leap, but definitely a big step forward.
And Karl-Heinz, Kamp, last word to you.
Well, I think half a glass is already a lot. Just an anecdote, when we got the first draft in October, and there was some skepticism in the Ministry of Defense, how these diplomats in the Auswärtiges Amt will do it, a colleague of mine said this draft could have been written at the General Staff College in Hamburg of the Bundeswehr. And I think this shows something that we came far away.
All right. And with that, thank you very much to our panelists, Guntram, Wolff, Aylin, Matlé, and Karl-Heinz Kamp. Thank you all for joining us this morning, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. A very good morning to all. Thank you.